Thank you for joining us for this study on the context of biblical history. This week, we're going to be considering the Greek Empire. For many reasons, this study is more important than any of the ones that has preceded us, because whenever you think in terms of the Babylonian Empire or the Persian Empire, you're talking about things that are so far removed from us as to be very esoteric. But with the Greeks, we begin to run into very familiar names and places, ideas, things that have shaped Western culture. For this reason, we find that a study of the Greek Empire is important. The Greek people go back into antiquity. In fact, the earliest development of the Greek city-states is shrouded in mythology. The Trojan War, described by Homer, was roughly the same time as the United Kingdom, the time of King Saul, David, and Solomon, about 1,000 years before Christ. Through this time, we find some shreds of historical evidence, and yet a great deal of mythology. Solid history would come into play with the first Olympiad in 776 BC. From that time on, we have what we would think of as a clear historical record of the Greek states. Now, the various city-states were independent for many, many years. There would be the hegemony of Athens or of Sparta, and yet they all together were city-states. They were not a united country of Greece. It was only later, under Macedonian influence, that they would come together. The formation of an empire was begun by Philip of Macedon, king of Macedonia. Though he was not really a Greek, his nation had been highly influenced by Greek thought and Greek culture, and he wanted to lead a united Greece against Persia. He trained his son Alexander to carry out his ambition. It's interesting with Philip that he knew that his desire, his plans, his aspiration for Macedonia could not be accomplished in one man's lifetime. And so it was he prepared not only Alexander, but an entire cadre of youth to be leaders of the Macedonian Empire. Alexander has come to be known by us as Alexander the Great. He's called this because there are many Alexanders in the lineage. He was not the first, and there would be others, but he is the notable one, Alexander the Great. In 343 BC, at the age of 13, Alexander was tutored under Aristotle. Philip wanted his son to be thoroughly Greek in outlook, and he interviewed various scholars to see who would come. And he settled on Aristotle. And it's interesting, the price that Aristotle exacted. You see, Philip had razed Aristotle's hometown, had completely destroyed it, had exiled or imprisoned all the inhabitants. And so, in exchange for coming to tutor his son, Philip rebuilt the city, gave amnesty to all of the slaves and exiles, let them come back, and Aristotle himself was given a very grand residence in Macedonia and a very favored place at court. He not only trained Alexander, but individuals like Ptolemy that will figure in later, the generals, the young men who grew up with Alexander would be his cadre. They would be his companions. They were trained also by Aristotle with Alexander. As a result, Greek thinking permeated the upper classes of Macedonia. Philip appointed Alexander regent of Greece when he was only 16 years old, and at age 20, upon his father's death, he assumed command of the Greek army. Now, obviously, with any transition, there would be intrigue, and Alexander had to consolidate his power, but he did so with remarkable speed. In the spring 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont River, and this should be 35,000 men, and began the conquest of the Persian Empire. 35,000 men crossing from Europe into Asia, into what we now think of as Turkey. If you'll think of Istanbul, Istanbul is a city on two sides of the Hellespont. This is where Alexander crossed. And he crossed with what we think of as a large number, 35,000, but he came up against a force of Persians numbering in the hundreds of thousands. But he defeated the Persians at Issus, at the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. The conquered Persians had numbered 600,000. Alexander captured the wife and children of Darius III, the Persian emperor. Darius then ran away to Susa, to the capital, to raise another army, which would then be defeated in due course. Having achieved this victory over the Persians, Alexander turned his attention south to Tyre on the Phoenician coast. Now, the city of Tyre figures prominently in biblical prophecy, and we must be careful whenever we look at the prophecies and we look at the flow of biblical history to remember that there were two notable cities. There was old Tyre that was destroyed, and then a rebuilt city that would also be destroyed. The old city of Tyre was prophesied to be destroyed by Isaiah. In 740 BC, Isaiah had prophesied the destruction of Tyre, which would come to pass in 586 BC. Ezekiel had specifically prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar would be the destroyer of Tyre. So the old city was prophesied to be destroyed, and it was. But then it was rebuilt. Now, if you think about ancient warfare, the primary way in which a city was destroyed was through a siege, where it would be cut off from the outside world. And in doing this, the inhabitants would either starve or lack water, or they would surrender. But when Tyre was rebuilt, it was not rebuilt on the mainland, as it had originally been located, but on an island in the Mediterranean. Now, if you'll think about an island surrounded by water, they could not be laid siege in the same way. However, the prophet Zechariah prophesied that this stronghold would be smitten in the sea and devoured with fire. We read of this in Zechariah 9, 3 and 4. How would this be accomplished? Alexander achieved a feat of tremendous engineering and military genius. In fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy in 332 BC, Alexander destroyed Tyre by building a causeway from the mainland to the island, thereby being able to lay siege. After a siege of 7 months, 8,000 inhabitants were slain and 30,000 were sold into slavery. The destruction of Tyre is considered the greatest military achievement of Alexander. By the way, the 30,000 sold into slavery, as with the various victories that were attained, we find that Alexander generated tremendous wealth. To have 30,000 slaves that you sell would generate a tremendous amount of capital. This would be sent back to Macedonia, solidifying his hold on his empire. Having overrun Tyre, Alexander headed south toward Jerusalem. The question was, what would happen? Jerusalem, Judea, was a dependency of Persia, but the Persians had been driven out. The Jews did not really have an army per se. And here we have the Macedonians marching on them. But what they had was their priesthood. And so as Alexander approached, he was met by Jaddua, the high priest. At the head of a long procession of people, the people were all dressed in white. The priests were dressed in purple and scarlet, and he had a mitre on his head. Wearing the headdress of the high priest, wearing his vestments, he would have been a very impressive figure. Alexander approached the high priest and saluted him, indicated that he had seen this very person, the high priest, in a dream. Alexander believed, because of this, that his army, that the army of Alexander, was under divine conduct. Alexander refused to allow his soldiers to harm the Jews, and he accompanied them back to Jerusalem. He went up to the temple and was shown the book of Daniel, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians. He supposed that himself was the person intended. Josephus describes this for us in his Antiquities. Because of this special relationship that Alexander had with the Jews, they were given certain privileges. Alexander allowed the Jews to continue in their laws and religion and to pay no tribute each 7th year. Now this is very different, for in the rest of his empire, Alexander followed a practice of syncretism, where the local religions were brought into alignment with Greco mythology, where the gods of Greece would be veneered over the local gods. But he did not do this to Jehovah. He did not do this with the God of the Jews. The Jews had a separate arrangement. By the way, this is an interesting point because later, under the Romans, Jews were given special privileges also. These special privileges caused outsiders to hate Jews. Anti-Semitism had its roots often in the way in which Jews were separated from others. Noteworthy, Alexander permitted the Jews not to pay tribute every 7th year. If you'll remember, under the Old Testament law, every 7th year was a year of rest. The fields were to lie fallow. You had to save up for that 7th year, and you had to make it through that 7th year. As a result, Alexander permitted the Jews not to pay their tribute on that 7th year. From Jerusalem, Alexander went to Egypt, where he founded the city of Alexandria to accomplish his goal of exporting the Greek culture into every country he conquered. Now we begin looking at Alexandria, and we find that this is one of many cities that Alexander founded on which he put his name. But this is the city of Alexandria. It would become a center of Greek culture. In many ways, it would rival the strongholds of culture back in Greece, especially with the great library that would be assembled there. Probably the greatest library of the ancient world. The destruction of it later is considered to be one of the great tragedies of all time. Alexandria in Egypt would figure prominently throughout the rest of the history of God's people and well into early church history. After leaving Egypt on the plain of Arbela, not far from the site of ancient Nineveh, Alexander completely defeated the Persians. The Persian despot tried to escape. He was assassinated by his own guards. Alexander then took vengeance on them for having killed the emperor. But Alexander began to adopt for himself many of the trappings of the Persian court. This caused a degree of unrest among his troops. But as they moved forward, They not only covered the entirety of the nations that were part of the Persian Empire, they moved outward to the east into India. He marched into the Indus River Valley, conquering many of the states there and building cities. Eventually, his Macedonian troops said, enough. They wanted to go home. They wanted to see their parents, their wives, their children. They were tired of being away from Macedonia. Alexander did his best to get them to go forward. They would not. He relented and turned back. He wanted to establish a capital in Babylon, but Babylon would never be inhabited again. It had been prophesied to be a waste, and so it was. And while Alexander was settled in Babylon, he did die. Upon his death in 323 BC, his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. Alexander did not leave any heir. Ptolemy was the king of Egypt, Seleucus of Syria, Lysimachus of Thrace and Bithynia, and Cassander of Macedonia. Of these 4, the 2 that we will be dealing with are the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria, because in between Syria and Egypt is the land of Palestine, and for that reason it figures very prominently in the biblical narrative. When we think about the Greek Empire, we recognize that it is a tremendous influence on us today. There are many things culturally that we have in our Western civilization that have its origin in Greece. But more than anything, the Greek language. Because of Alexander and his successors, the Greek language spread around the Mediterranean and even further east. For that reason, in the 1st century, whenever the church produced the New Testament, God had a perfect vehicle through which to share the message of the gospel to the world. The Greek language, with its subtlety, with its precision, was a perfect literary instrument. And having been spread around the Mediterranean, it enabled the gospel to be spread far and wide. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be looking at the Ptolemies, the Seleucids. We'll look at the Jewish revolt, and then we're going to see the establishment of the eternal kingdom, the Lord's church. Thank you for joining me for this study, and I look forward to seeing you next week.